Welcome to the Mycelium Network podcast, a podcast all about early stage web developers and the mentors and teachers that help them along the way. Hey, Vuyisile, thanks so much for joining me for the Mycelium Network podcast.
The pleasure is mine. I'm happy to be here.
How's your day been so far?
It's been a good day. It's raining here in Zimbabwe, so rain is always welcome.
Yeah, that's very true. So, I think let's just get this conversation right off to a start. So I know you from way back in the day when we met at a Mozilla event, I believe it was. I think it might even have been something to do with Firefox OS still back in the day.
That was in Johannesburg.
That is correct. And after that, I've been following you on Twitter, and I've been seeing the conversations you've been having and all the things you've been up to. And when I started this whole community and I started the podcast, I've always meant to invite you. So I'm glad that I finally did and that you were available and that we can have this conversation. Because I do think that you have a interesting perspective and that you have a good story to tell, and I would love to give you a voice. So, to get us started, tell us more about who you are, how you got into development, where did you grow up, anything that in your early years that might have been a catalyst to, kickstart your career, kickstart your interest in tech. And then just as an aside at some point, I'm always curious when people have like a pseudonym on the internet, what the story behind it is. And on GitHub and Twitter, you have this pseudonym called Terra Mayar, if I'm pronouncing it correctly. Mm-hmm. So I'm curious if there's a story behind that.
Okay. All right. That's okay. Let me tell my story. So I was raised in Zimbabwe. I've always loved tech and computers. I've always been intrigued by how they work, and I'd say I'm a logical person. I think in very in a bullet point kind of way, like a very sequential way. And computers work the same, and so I've just understood them. And so I've always loved computers. And I used to go to my sister's workplace just to play with her computer. Back in the day, we didn't have a computer. I didn't have a personal computer at home. So the only computers I came across were computers in people's workplaces. So I would always visit friends and family's offices just to use their computers, and that's how I got to learn how to use a computer. And then once I knew enough, I started going to internet cafes and messing around on the internet. Started joining forums and chat groups and things like that. And so that's how my interest in computers was. What it peaked at that point, I'd say. And then after high school, I went to a polytechnic college. I studied IT. So I learned formally about computers and information technology. Unfortunately, I wasn't able to graduate because of financial problems and some other personal reasons that kept me from completing that course. But I still loved it, and I still carry that knowledge I gained from them with me. So after college was done, I started contributing to open source. That's when I found Mozilla. I joined Mozilla community. At first, I was just doing translation. I worked on Firefox OS translation into Ndebele, the language I speak here. And then from there, as I met more people, I got more and more involved in the community. I then contributed to QA. We used to do QA testing for pre-release Firefox builds and even Firefox OS at some point. And then that was when I was introduced to programming, because a lot of the QA engineers at Mozilla used Python to automate the tests that they used to run against Firefox or many of the internal Mozilla websites they were testing. So that's when I was introduced to Python. I got interested and I started learning it. So I started learning, that was around 2014, I think. And yeah, that's when my Python journey started. And then after that, after a few years, I learned Python. I watched some YouTube tutorials, I read some books, I bought some courses, and I got good at it. But unfortunately, I wasn't able to get a job because something the tech bros on YouTube don't tell you is, when you're learning a tool or a programming language, you need to learn something that makes sense for where you are. And Python there isn't a big market for Python here in Zimbabwe, so I learned that the hard way. But yeah, after a while, I eventually found remote jobs, and that's how I got into software development using Python.
Okay.
Yeah.
That's interesting. That is an interesting perspective to think about not only which language, but which language is in demand where you live. I guess that's to some extent true in South Africa as well. I know I don't know now. I've not been super in touch with the workforce in South Africa for quite some time, but I know when I started, Java was definitely the language du jour. Like if you wanted a job, you had to know Java. That's why I always said I have a love-hate relationship with Java because I never enjoyed the language, but I am grateful for the opportunities that it given me because it introduced me to open source, and it allowed me to get a decent paying job, which allowed me to explore some other avenues. But I definitely quickly discovered that for me, that wasn't the language, and especially not J2EE, the enterprise stuff was definitely not where my love and interest lie. But I'm grateful for what it introduced me to. So is there a story behind Terra Major, or is it just something you picked?
Oh yeah. I forgot to mention. So when I was fooling around on the internet, I wanted to have a pseudonym I could use across all my socials, right? And the name Vuyisile is a pretty common name here in Africa. So most of the time when I try to use the name, it will be taken. So I had to come up with something unique, but that also spoke to the kind of person I was. So Terra Major is an acronym. I'd say it describes me in a sense. It stands for tremendously exuberant, resolute, and real attitude. That's a Terra, and I think that's what I am. I like to say, and then major is just like a major, like a title from in the army.
Oh, okay.
Someone who has that attitude and who's also a major. And then I just spelt it different, weirdly, so that I would always be unique.
That's very interesting.
So so that I did that when I was young, just straight out of college, and the name stuck. Unfortunately, I've built my brand, so to speak, quote unquote, around that name. So I haven't really changed it. So you'll find most of my socials, I'm Terra Major on most of my socials. It's like GitHub, Twitter, everywhere.
That's very interesting. Yeah, I always like hearing the stories behind the names. So, as you mentioned, even though Python wasn't the language that you needed in Zimbabwe to get a job, it's still a language that you learned, and I know that you love Python. Well, that's what I can tell from your tweets and like all the stuff you do. So, and I have to say, like, if I had to pick a backend language other than Node, i.e. JavaScript, I would probably pick Python as well. I really love the syntax. I really like the rules of Python, like how you think in Python. It resonates with me very much. So, but you, as somebody who uses Python as your main language, what is it about Python that attracted you, and what do you love about Python?
Okay, so like I mentioned, firstly, is I learned Python because that's what all the cool engineers at Mozilla used, right? That's what first got me into Python. But then, as I learned, it was really easy for me to learn. Unlike languages like C++ or Java, it read like English. It was, it's very straightforward. You can pick up a Python program and figure out what it does, even when you're not very experienced with programming. So that was what got me interested in Python. But really, what made me love the language as much as I do is the community. It is a very fantastic community, and as someone who was finding their way, I was on my own. I didn't have a college degree. I didn't have a lot of support here, so I had to lean on the Python community to basically get mentorship, get opportunities, and the community was fantastic. Very friendly people, very helpful, and very accommodating. So that's what really made me like the language as much as I do. But another thing is it's really sentimental, because I learned Python and then I couldn't get a job. So I had to make a choice. It was either I pick up a language like Java or one of the .NET languages that are common here in order to get a job, or I could just stick it out, and not give up and just keep pushing until I got the job, because I'd already put in the time to learn this language. So that's what I did. I chose the second option. I was like, hey, you know what? You've really put in this work. Just see it through. So I went through a very difficult phase where I forced myself to learn enough Python to get a job. That was my goal. I was like, you know what? Just get a job where you can use Python, and then that way I won't feel like a failure for learning it. And so it's one of those things where I just had to stick through with it. I had to make it work. So yeah. So I did that. I got the job, and now I'm actually trying to move away from Python and learn different languages. I don't want to be the Python guy. I just want to be able to code in Python and other languages. So yeah.
Is there any other language specifically that you're thinking about?
Go and Rust on my radar.
Yeah, those are good ones.
Yeah.
I always mean to learn Rust, but JavaScript evolves so fast that I'm finding it hard enough to keep up with JavaScript.
You don't have the time, right?
Exactly. Yeah. That I'm just like, oh my goodness, what's this new thing in JavaScript today? Oh, okay, wait, let me just figure this one out first before I try a new language. But at some point, I'd like to learn Rust, because I think some of the back end stuff that I'm doing, I think, especially the one side project I'm working on, if that kicks off and is successful, I think it would be beneficial if I have the backend written in Rust as opposed to in Node.
Yeah.
I think Rust will allow me to scale much, much better than doing Node. Because with Rust, if I understand correctly, I'm going to be much closer to the metal instead of having to go through a translation layer that then speaks to the metal, which is always a good thing if you want to eke out that extra bit of performance. So I'll probably just have to, that's basically how I learn. I put myself in a situation where I'm like, okay, I'm going to do this project and I'm going to do it in Rust. And now I have no choice. I have to learn it. I don't know. That's just how I learn. So I have to think which area I want to go into. Let's dig into community a little bit.
Okay.
Because among the many things I do is, I've started this community called Mycelium Network, but I'm also the community manager for MD and Web Docs at Mozilla. So I'm more and more involved in everything community. And one of the reasons for it is, like you said, I think it's often the differentiator and the enabler for a lot of people, where you don't feel alone. Because I think oftentimes it's not easy to give up, but you're more likely to give up if you don't have a community that either holds you accountable or simply inspires you, or both.
Yeah.
So what are your feelings? So that's how I think about community. What is important to you about community?
Well, it's two things really: it's sharing of skills and opportunities. Like when you're learning on your own, when you're self-taught, or when you're just figuring stuff out from reading a bunch of tutorials online, you really don't know what you don't know. And the communities, it's beneficial to be part of a community with people who are more experienced than you, because they can help you see the things or figure out the things you're supposed to know that you're not aware that you don't know, So that helps a lot. And it helps also, like you mentioned, to see people doing the stuff you want to do in the real world and, actually making an impact using the stuff you're learning. So it gives you then motivation to work towards a goal to be like them. Like I mentioned, I learned Python because the cool engineers at Mozilla were using it and it looked cool. And I liked that. I wanted to be like them. And then that's what got me involved. And then along the way, as I was learning, I had people in the community I could reach out to for help when I needed it. And these are people who are leaders in respecting different fields. And so I knew I was always getting the right kind of guidance and right kind of information. And it helped to have that. Unlike where you just have to Google, like on Stack Overflow or something, it helps to have that human connection.
Yeah, for sure. I totally agree. So then on a slightly related but tougher topic, I'd just like to get your input. So I recently learned that of all contributions to open source, only 17% comes from Africa. That blew my mind, because that's a very, very small number if you take into account how many people are on this continent. Yeah. Now, so my one question is, what do you think are holding people back from it? And then, what role can open source play in lifting people up and creating opportunity? Because I strongly believe open source has tremendous possibility to open up doors for people. And I think you've experienced it through the whole Mozilla thing, and you mentioned getting into open source early. So what are your thoughts on those topics? Like, why do you think there's such a small number of people contributing to open source? And like, what can we do about that?
Man, this one is a tricky one, because I think it's to do with lack of access. So I'd say there's poorly developed infrastructure that plays a role. Lack of skills to effectively contribute to some open source project, and I guess this also falls under infrastructure. Is internet access is not widely distributed. I mean, evenly distributed in Africa. So you'll find that in landlocked countries, generally, the internet tends to be slower because they don't have a lot of inland fiber connections. So because it's slower, they use technologies like satellite, UHF, and whatnot. These are slow and expensive. So internet access, for the most part, is not a lot of people have access to high speed internet, and if they do have it, it's expensive. That's the first problem in most of Africa. Then there's of course the power problems, and it's a lot of infrastructure problems. Then that aside, I think a second reason why we don't have a lot of contributions in open source is time. I'd say one has to be privileged in a sense to be able to contribute to open source. I don't like saying this, but I'll say it here. Because you need to have time you're willing to give away basically for free, because you're not being compensated for that time to work on something. So not a lot of people have that time, because most people, especially people from disadvantaged backgrounds, they're more focused on putting food on the table. So they're doing paid work. So that's the second thing. And then I think the third thing would be skills, right? So Africa in general hasn't had a lot of time to develop skill and talent as much as the West or Asia has. So we're still playing catch up with the rest of the world. So there's still a skills gap that needs to be filled. And I think once that is filled, we'll have developers or members of the community in positions where they can contribute better. So you'll find that most of the contributions to open source, I think, don't quote me on this, but I think you'll find that most of them come from economies that generally perform better, like Nigeria, South Africa, Egypt, or Kenya. So the better infrastructure, better economies, and better levels of education, and better access to hardware, and like these opportunities. You have big tech companies setting up, lots of startups. So it's a very difficult problem, but I think there's definitely lots of opportunity in contributing to open source. And I gained a lot from working in open source. I learned a lot of things that I wouldn't otherwise have learned just from reading books or watching video tutorials. I've had opportunities that came as a result of that, but the unfortunate truth is that it's not easy for everyone to get into it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So, I also sometimes wonder, because in the few interactions I've had, where we've, like during Hacktoberfest, we as a community worked on this project that's ongoing, but we kind of focused on it, and it was incredible to find how unfriendly a lot of open source tools and stuff is if you're on a Windows machine, for example, as opposed to a Mac or even Linux. And I think in Africa it's probably more prevalent for people to have Windows machines than it is to have Macs.
Yes.
For sure, Macs. And maybe a lot of people don't know about Linux, and also don't know which are the more user-friendly installations of those that has a more Windows-like experience, but will give you a better... And then, of course, Windows has come a long way in the sense of Windows subsystem for Linux, but you need to run the very latest version of Windows. And, you know, that sometimes means you have to have a pretty decent machine. So if you can't afford the expensive computer, you can't run the latest Windows, and so you don't have access to WSL. So there you go. So I think that might be another problem, and you mentioned hardware access being one of the problems. Mm-hmm. I wonder if something like an incubator for open source in Africa would go some way towards this, because what I'm thinking is it's a means for young, and this not young in age, young and experienced people to have a starting point where they get paid a decent enough salary to work on open source, and through that they then can get introduced to more opportunities. So it's the incubator serves as a on-ramp into the industry. So it takes people in, it skills them up, and through skilling them up, they get paid, but they also contribute to open source projects, which again benefits a whole large part of the economy because everybody depends on open source these days. But then it gets them to a point where they can then leave the incubator and either start their own thing or join a company, because now they've experience and they could contribute to open source because, like you said, they can still put food on the table because they're actually getting paid to do that. What do you think about something like that?
I actually think it's a good idea, and I'd really prefer it if this came from like the highest level, say, have governments introduce open source policies, right? Policies that would drive demand for open source software. Say, for instance, a government were to stipulate that all government departments would use open source operating systems and open source software. So that would mean you'd have to have people skilled in installing these operating systems, in managing these operating systems, and using the software, and it would save them money, which is a good thing for government because most of these tools are free. Open source is free, and then it would then create demand for people with skills in using or handling open source software. And then these incubators would then have a pipeline, like you draw in the talent, you train the talent, and you have somewhere to move that talent to because there's demand on the other side. So I think it would be a really good thing for all parties involved. Open source is free, so that cuts costs. It creates opportunities for people using it, and then it's a win-win for everyone.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's a very good idea for governments to adopt this. My experience is that is it's a hard place to start.
Okay.
It feels like it almost feels like industry needs to. I don't know how exactly this would work, but they have to kind of put pressure on the government to adopt these things, because I'm not sure that the governments even know. Like they just pay the licensing fee they've been paying for 20 years because it's what they've been doing. I don't know if there's enough, like companies. I know there's a company in South Africa called OpenUp, and they do quite a bit of this where they actually interface with municipalities and stuff like this. And they are very much into opening up data, but also the use of open source and that kind of stuff. So I think it's kind of like an education kind of thing where there needs to be these companies that show government the benefits of open source and show the possibility of creating jobs and developing talent. And maybe through creating something. Exactly.
Yeah.
And maybe through setting an example, they'd be more willing to adopt it. And you'd probably have to start on a small scale. You might have to start with your own municipality and getting them to adopt some open source software, and then them going to their leaders and saying, hey, my goodness, look, we've been using this thing that we learned from these other guys, and it's saving us so much money, and there's a bunch of people that's being trained that knows how to run these things. And then maybe, it goes up the chain and eventually it gets adopted wider. I think there are some Asian countries that's actually doing a really good job with this. For some reason, Taiwan always comes to my mind, but I'm not sure if it's them who's really adopted like a complete, and I think even South America, like Brazil and them, I think they've also adopted open source software quite heavily. So I think there's scope for that. And I do think that in the end of the day, that would be a good thing. But I do think industry will need to set an example and prove that, and offer proof that it's not just talk. It's, it's for real. Like the benefits are real. But yeah, I think that might be something that would be nice if one can get like a couple of companies together to try this out and see what one can do. I think there are some education, some places doing education in South Africa that has kind of got this idea. But again, there you sit with the problem of the monetary problem, whereas you're studying, so you're not earning anything yet, and so you have to, and that's definitely a massive problem. I mean, unemployment in South Africa is something like 50%. So if you have an unemployment rate of 50%, people don't have a lot of free time to give away of their precious time that they have. So you have to incentivize them monetarily as well. So on that topic, go for it.
I just want to say, like, this has a positive effect on people actually involved in work that actually use the software, because say a municipality needs a certain feature, right? They could have their employees build the feature and then release it back into open source.
Exactly.
So I mean, it's a hard problem to solve, but it has lots of benefits if it were to be implemented right.
Yeah, no, for sure. And I mean, and talking about that, I know you were a freelancer. I think you recently took a full-time position.
Yeah.
Am I correct there? Okay, cool.
Yeah.
So, to dig into that a little bit, so in the beginning of this year, I officially started my own company. It's an open startup, which means we are fully transparent in terms of income, in terms of what we pay people, who our employees are. If the employee is okay with it, of course, we're not going to publish their stuff publicly if they don't want us to do that. But so far, everybody's fine with that. Our expenses, everything is open. And of course, we are heavily invested in open source. The company is completely based around open source. We give back to open source. We have a mandate of any project we rely on, we have to either financially or through contributions give back.
Mm-hmm. What's your product?
But so at the moment, it's mostly around consulting and education, but we're building two products. One that's developer facing. It's called Developer Tool Chest. It's a way of collecting a bunch of tools that you use often and giving you easy access to it. Mm-hmm. So you can just contribute to it anything and you tag it in ways that you'd obviously want to find it later on. And then it's just like a search interface. And also allow easy discovery of other tools you might not know about. And then we have some plans for it going forward. The other one is called Our Backyard. And that is a platform to help small businesses get in front of people. So it's easy to find big box stores because they have thousands of rands to spend on advertising and big signs and big buildings, whereas a lot of small businesses run from their own little house and, they don't have a bunch of money. And so the idea is that Our Backyard is literally what the name suggests. It's where you go to find small businesses in your own community and support local business in your own community. So it's got it's got that good thing to it, but then down the line, we will look at how we can responsibly make some money from it, because of course, at some point it needs to make a profit.
Of course,
we want to do it responsibly. So privacy is extremely important to us. So we don't want to stick a bunch of advertising in front of you. We don't want to track you everywhere you go. But we'll find a business model that works. Maybe it's something as simple as, if this service is valuable to you, give money to it on a monthly basis. Maybe it's a business model like that, kind of like Open Collective. Maybe it's because it's also built open source. The whole platform is built in the open. But with that said, it's not easy. It's definitely not easy. Yeah. And doing it in the African context brings its own challenges. And I heard a talk on a podcast of a guy called Lex Friedman, where he spoke to a woman that she started a business in Lagos and then she started a business in the US. And she was talking about how different the experience was between the two. And what it boiled down to was that in the United States, with all its problems, the system is set up for you to succeed. Whereas, in her words, in Africa, it's set up for you to fail. Because the infrastructure, the support, it's just not there. More often than not, she got where she did because she knew the mayor in the town and she could ask for a favor. Whereas if she didn't, she might never have gotten electricity to her business and the business would have failed. All these kinds of things. So I'm curious, because there's another thing. Let me, because I know you struggled with this. So if you're in a first world country and you want to experiment with something, so you want to create a newsletter and then you want to put some aspect of it. Maybe you want to allow people to post comments on your newsletter, but only if they're a paid member, for example. Now, there's an array of options to do that. You can use Substack, you can use Ghost. There's a bunch of things. But if you're from Africa, you're going to hit a problem. And that is because the only processor they support is Stripe, and we do not have access to Stripe in Africa. In the entire continent, we don't. Now, Stripe offers this thing called Stripe Atlas. I don't know if you've heard about that.
But that like where they set up a business for you or something?
Yeah, they create an LLC for you in Delaware in the United States. Yeah. But the thing is, it costs $500 to get that set up. and then $100 per year to keep that LLC going. Now, if you just want to experiment with a newsletter, that's a massive investment of money for something you don't know if it's going to succeed, and where you're going to charge people probably like $2 a month for a subscription.
Yeah.
So with all that context that I've given now, what were the problems that you faced that put you in a position where you had to say, you know what, I'm going to have to stop this freelance thing for a while and just get a paid job where I'm a little bit more certain of my salary?
So before I started working as a developer, I used to run a web hosting business. I ran it for a few years, and the biggest problem I've faced was the changes in business environment in Zimbabwe. The regulations are always changing. It's very hard to plan for your business, and getting money into a bank account is very difficult because I think our currency has changed. I think we've changed currencies 4 or 5 times in the past few years. So one minute we're using US dollars, next minute we're using something different. And so that lack of consistency just made it very difficult. So there were problems that were bigger than me that affected the clients that I had. Everyone was affected by this business environment. So you'd have situations where clients weren't able to pay me on time, or if they were able to pay me, I'd just have problems collecting the money, because if you have a client outside outside Zimbabwe, getting money into Zimbabwe is very difficult because of these problems with our banking system and everything. So that was the biggest problem for me, is just moving money, cash flow problems because of the changes and lack of consistency. So I'd say that was the first one. And then the second challenge I had is we have a number of payment options here. We have mobile money, we have bank transfers, we have online payments from debit cards and credit cards. But getting support for all those is very difficult. For instance, the mobile money is run by a few telecoms companies, or the biggest one is Eco Cash, and they're not very open to providing their API to small businesses. So if you're starting out and you want to accept Eco Cash payments, say, or mobile money payments, it's not very easy to get that. So that's one of the first problems. And then the second one is the payment processors we have here charge very high fees, just like Stripe does, their yearly fees, and so it can go against running your business, because you end up paying more to these payment processors than you are actually taking in. And then the last straw for me was the payment processor I was using at the time just shut down. No warning, no compensation, no communication, nothing. It just shut down one day and it just stopped working. So migrating the business to a new payment processor would have just taken too long. And they're like, hey, you know what? I don't need this. So that's when I notified all my customers. I just gave them free service for about a year, while I helped them move their websites to different hosting providers. And then that was it. That's when I was really done. And then I started looking for a job. So yeah, it's hard to run a business here in Africa because of infrastructure problems and the business environment that's just not set up that doesn't set you up for success. So getting a job was another challenge. Because the economy in Zimbabwe is not great right now, and so and that was the first thing. And the second thing was the skills I had learned that I couldn't get a job for the skills I had. So I was forced to get a remote job from international companies. So that comes with its own challenges. But fortunately, I did get a job. I have a job now. I'm happy. So yeah.
Oh, I'm glad to hear that. So, okay, let's step back into something else. There's there's a project that I believe you started, and I believe I saw the tweet when this idea started in your head, that ended up being PyPy in a box.
Yeah.
Do you want to dig into that? Because that's really, really cool. I read about it a bit more today, and it's really cool.
Yeah,
if you want to tell us more about that.
So what started this project is part of the problems we've been talking about, the infrastructure problems here in Africa. You go to a meetup, you're running a workshop, you want people to install some packages, and then the internet goes out or the power goes out, right? So that basically means you can't do anything, and you just have to talk through what you would have done. So I got to a point where I attend a lot of conferences, and I attend meetups and workshops, and I do trainings at these events. And that was my biggest frustration, that I didn't have a reliable internet access or reliable power to run the workshops I needed to run. So I thought, hey, what could I do to allow people in the workshops, guest attendees to install the software and not be bothered by whether there's internet or not? And then I figured, what if I could download the packages I needed onto a little computer, build, make it a Wi-Fi hotspot, have everyone connect to it, and then they could download packages. So that's when I started tweeting about it, asking people how I could go about it. I did some research, and I figured it was actually not difficult because, firstly, Raspberry Pi is an affordable computer. At the time, they're still available, they're still affordable. You can buy, I bought one, got a very large, the largest size SD card I could get. I think it was 256 gigs. And then I cloned the Python package repository. So it's like the NPM package repository if you're from JavaScript world. So that was the download was about 100 gigs. So I downloaded the packages, and I found some software online that can recreate the structure of PyPI, which is the Python package index. So it recreated the structure and indexed the packages, and then I put a web server in front of that, and then I configured the Raspberry Pi to act as a Wi-Fi hotspot. So you can now, using this tool, do a pip install package name from a local repository instead of going to the Python package index. Pip, the package manager, can do that. It allows you to install from offline or local package repositories. So whenever we'd have an event here in Zimbabwe, I'd do that. I'd set up the Raspberry Pi, everyone would connect to it, and they'd run that one command, then they'd be able to install the packages that they needed. It's a simple device, but it really went a long way in making sure I could teach the way I wanted to teach. Whether there's internet or there's power, we always had a little Wi-Fi connection that could allow people to install software.
Yeah, that's super cool. So do you put a SIM card in the Raspberry Pi, and it uses that to connect to the internet, like mobile?
Oh, no. So the Raspberry Pi, the model I have is the latest model. So it has an Ethernet port, and it has Wi-Fi as well. So the way I have it set up is I connect it to internet via the Ethernet port, and then set up a Wi-Fi hotspot on its Wi-Fi adapter. So I can download packages using Ethernet, and then broadcast Wi-Fi network using the Wi-Fi adapter. Now, alternatively, you can download packages on your laptop and then transfer them onto its little SD card, because it uses an SD card as a hard drive. So you can set up everything, all the files you need on your computer on the SD card, and then transfer that to the Raspberry Pi. So it works just like a normal computer, except without, all the fancy bells and whistles you'd expect from a powerful desktop.
Yeah. That's super interesting. I know there's another project. It's not meant for Python or anything like that, but it's called Internet in a Box. I don't know if you know about that.
Yes, I came across it when I was working on this. Yeah, it's a very similar project. They do basically everything else. Lots of it's a digital library of different websites and stuff.
Yeah, like Wikipedia and that kind of stuff. So if you're in a rural area, you can put that down somewhere and people can have access to it. And then if you once a month just do an update from the internet to make sure you have the latest content, then, people don't need internet access to be able to access all this, which is amazing. I mean, it's sometimes the thing that stands between you and success is just having access to that content. So it's great.
I'm actually thinking of doing something similar. Like I've proven, when I started this, it was just a proof of concept to see if I could do it. But now what I want to do is I want to take the same concept and use it to make like my own internet in a box. So I only do Stack Overflow and Wikipedia. So I found a lab tool called Keywix that allows you to do this very easily. It bundles all the software you need to serve up cloaked content offline easily. So you just download the content, install this software, and then allows you to serve up something like Wikipedia or Stack Overflow easily. So that's the next thing I'm going to try.
Yeah, that sounds really cool. Do you know if there exists a similar thing to this for NPM, like NPM in a box?
I actually haven't heard anything like that. So I wouldn't know. I once asked on my Twitter if anyone knew, but I didn't get any responses. So I'm not sure if it's there or people just ignored me. I don't know.
Would it be, thinking about your experience creating PyPy in a box, do you think it would be a lot of the work you've done is transferable to creating something like NPM in a box? With what you've done, would that have a lot of the infrastructure just reusable for that, or is it very specific to PyPy?
I think it is. The concepts rather are reusable because I use a lot of Python packages to do this, but I think the principles can be applied to NPM. Now, I'm not sure how packaging works in the JavaScript world, but I imagine the JavaScript packages take up much more space than the Python packages are. So you need to find a way to download packages that you can fit into a Raspberry Pi, and then a way to index them and then serve them up. So probably for serving them up, you could use like a web server, like Nginx or something, and then indexing them. I don't know. I'm sure there's something NPM specific that you could do, but you just need to find the right tools. But it should definitely be possible.
Yeah. So what do you use for indexing PyPy? Because I'm thinking the name is just in my head now. It's out again.
So there's this thing called PyPI server. You just you point it to where you have the Python packages downloaded. It runs through the list and then creates an index. That makes it easy for the pip tool to find the package. You can find the package based on the name or its metadata. You can figure out what dependencies it depends on. So indexing really is useful. It saves you a bunch of time instead of searching through the entire package repo every time you want to do a pip install. Yeah.
I wonder whether Algolia or something like that. I wonder if you can run that on a server with NPM and use Algolia to index the NPM registry. That'd be interesting. I'm really curious if this is possible.
It would be an interesting problem to solve.
Yeah, no, for sure. Because, like you said, I'm sitting here now speaking to you, and the only reason I can is because I'm plugged into a big battery, because currently we're being load shed, so we don't have electricity at the moment. So I know what that's like. So I have a big battery that I'm plugged in, and because of that, I still have internet access, and I can actually, speak to you. And I only bought it this week, and it was very expensive. I had to put money aside, and thankfully I have a business, so I could, I did some extra work for extra clients, and so far it seems like it was definitely a good buy, but it's not cheap, and it's not something that's accessible to many people, unfortunately. So there's a lot of people around me sitting without electricity right now. So,
I did that recently, so I can relate.
Yeah. So, I can totally see a situation where you're in the middle of a workshop and boop, there goes the power, and you're like, oh boy, now what do we do? So being able to whip out a Raspberry Pi with NPM on it would be super useful. So I think it's something that as Mechanical Inc. should spend some time on. And I might just need to tap your brain for some knowledge.
Yeah, I'm happy to. I'd love to actually see that, because I know that would definitely have more of a use case here than the Python thing does, because they're generally more JavaScript developers around than Python ones. So
Interesting.
yeah.
So what I also saw is, I think maybe Pipeline in a Box presented an opportunity for yourself, because you recently gave a talk about it at the Ubuntu Summit in Prague.
Yes.
How was that experience?
So what happened is interesting. I gave a talk about the same project in Namibia at the Python conference in when did COVID start? 2020. Yeah. So I gave a conference. Yeah. The last conference I attended was just before COVID started. So in 2020, I gave a talk at Namibia, and one of the community managers at Canonical was in attendance at the conference. He heard the talk, and hey, that's actually a good idea. And so this year he invited me to speak at the Ubuntu Summit. So the Ubuntu Summit is it's a Ubuntu conference that seeks to invite community members and Canonical staff, put them in a room together for a few days, and share stories about how people are using Ubuntu and Linux and open source in general. So I got to present about how I was using Ubuntu on a Raspberry Pi to do that. So giving that talk, led to that opportunity to be invited to that conference. And it was my first time in Europe. I'd never been to Europe, so I got to travel to Europe, give the talk, meet fantastic people from the Canonical team. I had a fantastic time.
Yeah, it's always great. I remember the first time I went to the US when I started contracting at Mozilla. It was also like a complete culture shock. And you can understand how there's so many tech companies, because everywhere around you, like if you sit in a little coffee shop and you're just talking, everybody around you are talking about their startup and about this problem they're having with this program. And so there's this energy in the air that's very, very contagious. So I was wondering, like with that conference that you were able to attend in Prague, and now that we're kind of slowly walking our way out of the pandemic and but we've also learned some lessons about the fact that in-person events are great, but it doesn't necessarily, the world doesn't have to come to a complete standstill if we can't get on a plane and fly somewhere. So, we can do a lot of these things virtually. But so do you think if we can install more active conference circuit, so to speak, in Africa, do you think that would foster a more active startup culture? Because that's the one thing that I find is very, very active in Europe and in the US. And I think a lot of great ideas come out of just this concept of trying something and being willing to fail, but also being willing to pivot. But I do think, like I said, you have to have a culture. You have to have an active community that encourages this. So do you think if we can somehow, maybe starting all virtually, because that's also cheaper than having to fly all over the place and also better for the environment, do you think if we can install like this idea of having more Africa-focused conferences, speaking about stuff like what me and you have been talking about now, the challenges and possible solutions, do you think if we can kickstart something like that, that'll by its very nature install this idea of a startup culture?
I think it would, because, like we all have similar problems, similar challenges we face. And I think now physical conferences, like physical meetups, would actually work better than virtual ones, because I think, the networking opportunity that gives you allows people to just share ideas and talk about problems. Some of the things that people talk about come up even not in the conference talk, but in the hallway track or in the dinners or in the lunches or whatever. It's like we can share ideas, and conferences or meetups are very good places to talk about stuff or to learn about stuff you don't already know. So because like when you attend a conference, you can learn something you weren't aware that you didn't know, like, oh, that could be really useful for this project that I'm trying to solve. It allows you to make connections, to and to learn stuff. So I definitely think that conferences would help, because we don't have enough conferences, I'd say, or meetups, because most of the conferences I've seen are enterprise conferences where like just companies are getting together, and those are not, they're okay, but they're like a bottom line goal most of the time. And I think we need more community-focused conferences that will just allow people to meet and share ideas and figure out a way to solve common problems. So yeah, I think it would help.
Yeah, I 100% agree. Yeah, a lot of those others are more trying to sell you their products and services than really fostering a community of makers. So yeah, I agree. So you're a AWS-certified cloud practitioner, by the way. Congratulations on having achieved that. That's no small feat. But I do see that you also use a service called Divio. How do those differ, or are they more similar than different?
I'd say one is an abstraction over the other. So with like Divio is an enterprise solution, right? What their goal is to unify multiple clouds. So say you have a business, you want to put your business on the cloud, but you don't want to deal with the complexity of choosing a cloud, or you want to put some information in one region or on one cloud and whatnot. They take care of all that for you. So they just provide a unified platform. You upload your code, and then you can choose through a drop down, like what cloud you want to put this on, what region you want to put this on. Then they take care of all that. So you could actually have an app that has, say, some data in Azure, some data in Google, and then some data in AWS in a specific region. They can take care of that for you. So I'd say that's how they differ. But at the end of the day, I mean, Divio does use AWS under the hood. Now, if I were to release an app, develop an app, so there'd be times where I'd choose Divio and other times where I'd prefer to use AWS or another service. So Divio is mostly focused on enterprise. So you'll find that their paid plans are quite pricey. I think the cheapest plan, last I checked, was like $150 a month or something. But they have a very good free developer plan. So if I was just building a pet project that needed a home and a URL, load balancing, and a server, I'd use Divio. It's a very easy platform to use. You download their CLI, you Dockerize your project, you just push. It's very similar to Heroku.
Okay.
So they have a nice platform, good documentation, really easy to set up like Dockerized applications and give them an online presence. But I'd say AWS is, if I was running a business, I'd probably put my product on AWS or even Azure or any other cloud, because you get more options, more fine-grained control over what you spend your money on, AWS. And so there's easy solutions with AWS. If you just want to get an application online, there are solutions. There are things like Elastic Beanstalk. You can use an Elastic Beanstalk, just put up a website online, and then Amazon will take care of auto-scaling, load balancing, security, provisioning, and all that. Or if you have more skills, you can get a VPS. You can get a VPS from them and then do all that yourself. So it really depends on what you want to do, and how much time you have and how much money you're willing to spend. Because obviously AWS, like Elastic Beanstalk, is more expensive because it's a managed service. So you get a lot of things out of the box and you pay more for it. So it really depends.
Okay, interesting. So on that topic, a lot of I've spoken to somebody before, Chelsea Adams, and she also does quite a bit of like the AWS kind of stuff, but she also does front end and that kind of thing. But she's well versed when it comes to AWS, for example.
Okay.
And I think, and that one thing that she mentioned that I found interesting, and it's true. Most, I don't want to say all because that would be unfair, but most of these boot camps or even like longer term educational institutions that provide specifically education around front end development. they stop short of, okay, now I can build a React application, but now how do I put it online? Maybe they'll show you how to do it with like using GitHub pages or something like that. But I mean, if you want to do a production app, that's not really, the way you're going to go. And so the one thing that she mentioned is there's a hole there that needs to be filled. In the sense that there's not really any good education, accessible good education out there to teach front-end developers, how do I put this app of mine online the right way? It's easy to put it online, but how do I put it online the right way so that if I announce this on my social media network and some famous person retweets my thing and 10,000 people hit my website, that is not going to go down. And also that I'm not going to tomorrow morning wake up and somebody's going to say, why is there a bunch of porn on your URL because somebody hacked your website? Do you have any like tips or good resources or something that you can recommend to people if they want to like know how to do this stuff the right way?
Man, I didn't know front end had this problem as well. I thought it was just a Python problem. but yeah, deployment is hard. Which is actually one of the reasons why I got into DevOps. I wanted to learn more about deployment and how to do it and automate stuff and make it easy. But in terms of general tips, I don't have any resources I can think of right now, but I have a few tips that I'd like to give. Like there's certain things that I think most people aren't taught in these boot camps about how to make deployments go well. The first thing I think is to think about security from the get-go. Don't start thinking about security when you're ready to deploy. So that will help you avoid making mistakes that could later burn you. So you mentioned that you setting up a website and putting porn. So people can do that, and one of the reasons why some of these things are possible is, say you put up your code in Git, so first thing, learn how to use Git correctly. If your project doesn't need to be open source, don't make your code publicly available. Keep it private. That helps hide mistakes you may have made. Whereas if your project is publicly available and people can see sensitive information you don't want them to see, that gives them keys to doing bad stuff on your website. But in a more general sense, I'd say that the first thing to watch out for is just make sure you handle credentials correctly. Like don't hard code passwords and credentials into your code. That's easy to do when you're just mucking around locally, but you can forget to remove that stuff. So don't put credentials in the code. And if you're using environment files, try and avoid adding them to Git. Like don't track them, don't push them up to GitHub wherever you're pushing your code. So try and keep your code separate from your credentials. So there are services you can use, like you can use password managers to manage your passwords. You can use password vaults that would inject the credentials into your environment while you have it running locally, so that you never have your credentials available in an unencrypted text file, for instance. So there's things like that. I think KeePass has an open source tool you can install in your environment that can manage credentials for you. There's something called HashiCorp Vault. You can install that on your server. It manages secrets for you. And then once you're ready to deploy, I'd say make use of environment variables on the deployment server. So whatever service you're deploying to, put your passwords there, the secrets and credentials there instead of hard coding. So that's the first thing that would help reduce the risk of being hacked. It's not the only thing, but it really helps. And then I'd say the second thing is, if you can afford it, you try and get a service that allows you to auto scale easily. Like if you look at cloud solutions like AWS or Azure, there are tools that allow you to auto scale. So if you put up your website and it gets popular, all those auto scaling solutions will allow your traffic, will keep your website running even if it gets hit by like 10,000 requests or a lot of people start using it. It will cost you money, but you won't have to think about it because it's done for you. So if you can afford it, look into something like that. And then I think the last thing I'd say is try and make your deployments repeatable. Right now, and I know for front-end developers, this might mean learning some skills that they may not generally want to learn, but learn something about CI/CD and how that works. If you can get an automated deployment pipeline going, do that, because having that deploying code for you will allow you to run checks on your code, to make sure that the tool catches any errors you could introduce early before you actually do the deployment. So you can look into that and try and make the deployments as automated and as repeatable as possible.
Yeah. So I think GitHub is doing a lot to make this more accessible through GitHub CI/CD, their GitHub Actions and that kind of stuff. Do you use something like Terraform?
Not for the current projects I work on, no.
Okay. Yeah, I know some folks at Mozilla uses Terraform, and then Kubernetes, I think, is one of the other things that people use.
Yeah, I use Kubernetes, but not Terraform.
Okay. Yeah. But I think that those are all great tips, and I would highly recommend people look that up. And I'll add links to all of these things when we publish this episode. So in closing, something fun. In your bio on your website, you said you like cutting wood.
Yes.
Tell me more about that.
Okay, so software development is very stressful, and you need an outlet to, release that stress.
Yes.
Cutting wood is a very good outlet. Wood doesn't complain. Wood can take a beating. So I like to cut wood. But no, on a serious note, it's very similar to software development. You need to think about what you want to make. You need to design what you want to build. You need to choose the right tools, and you need to follow, like a logical sequence of steps to get to make whatever it is you want to make. And so it's I'd say it's a good hobby to pursue if you're a software developer, because many of the skills you learn, from developing software are easily transferable to woodworking. You just need to find the right tools, determine what you want to build. Like, I don't make any fancy furniture or anything like that. I can't do that. I make very simple tables and desks, like flat things,
gotcha.
Not flat corners, But it's a really nice, fulfilling feeling to work on something you actually built yourself.
Yeah, for sure.
And like I said, if you're stressed, you can hammer the wood all day and no one will mind, because you're probably going to make something good out of it. I really enjoy doing that and watching videos of experienced carpenters and woodworkers doing DIY stuff. I'm really heavily into DIY. I believe you should. Every person should at least know how to fix something.
Yeah, for sure.
So
for sure.
I really enjoy watching that stuff and trying it on my own when I have the time.
Yeah. I love those videos of the people that do the wood turning, where they have, those big fancy machines that like take this rough piece of wood and they turn it, and it's this beautiful shapes and just these gradients that the colors of the wood forms, and it's so
I know, right?
meditative to watch that stuff. It's just beautiful. So I can imagine if you can get to that point where you can actually do that yourself, it'll be an amazing experience. But I think even starting with a pocket knife and a piece of wood can be a nice start.
Definitely. I have a friend who actually started that way. He used to make these little walking sticks. And then now he runs a business and makes furniture. So
wow,
it can start as a hobby and turn into a business.
Yeah, for sure. That's great. Well, thank you so much for this conversation. I really, really enjoyed it. It was lovely to talk to somebody in Africa that shares a lot of the pain that I go through as well. But I think you also have some unique challenges that we in South Africa might not always face. But still, I think yes, there's a lot of opportunities, and I think we should connect more and cross-pollinate. And I'm definitely going to hit you up about the whole NPM in a box. I'm definitely going to contact you, and let's chat about that and make that a thing. I think that'll be super interesting to do, but also super useful. So thanks so much for the conversation, and have a lovely rest of your day, and all the best for the future. And I'm looking forward to seeing all the wonderful things you do.
Thanks a lot.
Cheers.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the Mycelium Network podcast. If you're not already, please subscribe, star, and leave a review for us in your podcatcher of choice. This helps others find us and helps us make a better podcast for you, our listeners. You can also find and follow us on Twitter at Network Mycelium and join the community on Discord. All the links are available in the show notes.